I'm delighted to be invited to give an international take on some of the things that you've been talking about this afternoon. Now, of course, leadership is one of those kind of fuzzy, nebulous concepts. We know it when we see it, but it can be quite difficult to pin down in practice. As we've seen, it's a bit like values or organisational culture, and often something that people think might be best left to the trainers, the academics, or the HR people. And of course, with like many serious things, we like to make jokes about leadership. But our recent experience shows what can happen when it's neglected or undervalued, be it in the private sector or the public sector. Given that I'm the last speaker, I thought it was better to show you a few moving pictures and cartoons to get everyone started. But when things go wrong, people are very quick to call for leadership. And unfortunately, it's not one of those things that can be turned on like a tap or conjured up at will. So I want to talk about what's been happening in some other OECD countries and what they've done over time to build and sustain the kind of leadership that they want to have in their public service. And by implication, of course, that will raise some questions that might provide some ideas about how that might be done in Ireland and how we might best go about that. And I do want to say that by focusing on the senior levels, I'm not implying that leadership is only about senior people, and I think somebody said that this morning. Leadership is something that is needed in different ways at all levels of organisations. Now, I just wanted to start by saying that there's a whole spectrum, of course, of arrangements in the senior public service in OECD countries. And what this graph is showing is the degree to which senior leadership is institutionalised. And that's about things like, the existence of a discernible, identifiable senior leadership group, the degree to which it's cohesive across the public service, the degree to which you can have the kind of mobility and interchangeability that Philip was talking about. And of course that varies, but Ireland would be quite low down in terms of its degree of... Pardon? It's so easy to make that mistake. So Ireland would be towards that end of the spectrum. And the trend is towards more institutionalisation rather than less for a variety of reasons, whether it's breaking down ministerial silos or whatever. Also, of course, the arrangements vary a lot between countries. I mean, you have France, which has a highly selective and I would say highly elitist system of entry to the ENA, that's the École Nationale d'Administration. And you get in there and basically you are the elect, and you then have a very, very well managed career around the French public service and very quickly moving into high positions. But I should say that in terms of its social representativeness, I think the surveys show that only about 3% of people from working class backgrounds get into that, and a lot of them are people whose parents have been elite civil servants as well. So I'm not sure that that's the kind of system that we would want to be. I hope the French ambassador isn't in the room anyway. That we would want to be proposing. And then you have other countries like Australia or Canada and so on, and the US, and they've long had senior executive services with their own distinct employment framework. Then you have other cases like the Netherlands that more recently, that used to have a very, very decentralised public service, and that about 10 years ago saw a need to have a more cohesive arrangement, and they set up a senior public service group. why are OECD countries putting this focus now on public service leadership? It's very high up on the agenda in countries, and I should say, it is well resourced because countries see it as being important. So it's something you do make choices about, I would say, even in situations where resources are short. And it's for all of the reasons that you can see on this slide. But I think that most of all is what's at the centre, and that's trust. And that there is a realisation that trust in government is a fragile thing, and that the quality of leadership, whether it's at the political level or the administrative level, is one of the most important things in terms of creating reputation and trust. So there is that renewed focus on what kind of leadership is needed and on what needs to be done, that it's going to be there when we need it now and into the future. And that's being reflected in a much more systematic and strategic approach to what's being done in OECD countries. Governments want to have an overall view of service-wide leadership requirements, and they want to have a view of what their available leadership talent is. And this is leading to much more of a focus on putting in place these kinds of senior leadership groups, on identifying talent, current talent, future talent, and on how you develop and select leaders. And in the time available, I'm just going to concentrate on a few examples that I think might be useful for Ireland. And that's not to say, of course, that you can just import other arrangements, holus bolus, from other countries. I mean, that's usually a recipe for disaster. But that you can valuably learn from others that have been doing it for a bit longer. And then, of course, you have to see what you can adapt and tailor to your own system. Now, I think it's very important to underline that these leadership initiatives are not in any sense simply new HR or training initiatives aimed at the top group. Of course, those are an element of it, but that's not really fundamentally what they're about. They are driven by a sense of real urgency about renewing the public sector and transforming it, and they are driven by concerns about the capacity to deal with future challenges. Creating a more formal senior leadership group is seen as a key instrument for public service reform and renewal. And it's also seen as a framework for enabling senior civil servants perhaps to engage with political leaders in new ways, to engage with them as a corporate group, to go beyond that one-to-one minister-civil servant relationship, and for the senior civil service to provide corporate leadership on critical matters. And I think that was mentioned as well by a few other people this morning, that element of corporate leadership. And for example, in the Netherlands, the creation of the Senior Civil Service Group has provided a context for political leadership and civil service leadership to redefine that political administrative relationship around the theme of renewal of national government. And in the UK, one of the main objectives of setting up the group that is called the Top 200 was for those people to be the corporate leadership of the civil service. And they have set up various structures around that. And it's made up of the most senior civil servants, the permanent secretaries, the directors general, and so on. And their explicit stated aim is for that group to improve public services, to deliver government business, and to build a stronger, better civil service. So it's very much about creating that kind of group that can take that corporate leadership role. And I want to talk now just briefly about leadership strategies and leadership capabilities and leadership development, and to just give a few concrete examples of what's being done in various countries. Now, increasingly, countries are developing public service leadership strategies that are run from the top and that are highly visible. And those strategies then, of course, have to be backed up by integrated policies and processes, i.e. a leadership framework, which is intended to create that common cohesive leadership culture across the public service. But it's not just about putting in place a senior leadership group. The bar is very much being raised in terms of giving that a very strategic, strong focus. And it's also being raised in terms of defining much more explicitly of what is expected of senior leaders in terms of their capabilities and their performance, and that's being done through putting in place formal senior capability profiles, the kind of thing that Alma was talking about in terms of the model that she used. And I would say too that there's a constant review. Those are not static systems, and there's a constant review to see whether changes and improvements are needed. And just to give you an example of that, this is New Zealand's senior leadership strategy. And New Zealand has done a lot in this area, and it has progressively put in place this comprehensive strategy. But that's something that has been built up over time, and there have been changes based on an assessment of how it was working, and it applies to all the top public servants, whether they're in departments or agencies or whatever. And as you can see, it's led right from the top by the Public Service Commissioner. And it places a lot of emphasis on building up leadership talent, building up that talent pipeline. It also places a lot of emphasis on having a diverse leadership pool to draw on. And that's not just about getting more women into the public service, although of course that is one of the important things. But it's about having people with diverse mindsets who can apply those diverse mindsets to those difficult, complex problems that governments have to deal with. So that's what it's really about. It's highly instrumental. And the UK is another government that has put now a senior leadership strategy into place. And again, it's led by the head of the civil service, and it focuses on those top 200 civil servants. And there's a leadership framework, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, that sets out very explicitly what's expected of those senior people, and that is used to identify talent, it's used to develop future leaders, and it's used to select people into senior positions. It's also used, interestingly enough, to assess the strength of existing departmental teams, so that gaps or weaknesses can be filled. So there's this process called capability reviews of departments that go on, and that's one of the tools that's used in that. And I think the other interesting thing about that is that it's not assumed that as soon as somebody gets into the top position that there's no need to develop them further. And so there is a corporate development program for the very top people, and there are corporate development programs for the people at the next couple of levels down. And there's also that high potential development scheme, and that's designed to identify staff at the next 1 or 2 levels down, and getting into that scheme is a highly competitive process. I think it's worth commenting. Philip mentioned that problem about, what do you do if you're going to identify these high potential people? Do you just then reach out and pluck them and put them in? And of course that would be very contrary to the merit principle, and that's actually not what tends to happen. A lot of governments do now have these high potential pools. People compete to get into them. They aren't just fingered to get into them, and it's a highly transparent process. People know what it takes to get in. It's built around these kinds of capability frameworks that I will talk about in a minute. And these people are moved around and given development, but at the same time, when jobs come up, they have to compete for them. They have to compete for them often with people from externally as well. And I think one of the interesting things you find is that even when, as is now the case in a lot of countries, senior recruitment is opened up to the external environment, you actually do not get that high proportion of people coming in from the outside. It's good for people bringing in people from the outside, but it often is the case that you do not get that higher proportion. And it's also, to use that cliche, the war for talent. Governments are very conscious now that they are competing with the best companies in the private sector, and they're competing in a global environment for talent. So if they don't begin to build that talent pipeline internally, they're not just going to be able to go outside and get the people they want. So that's really to just give you a bit of a context about how that notion of building up a talent pipeline works. And I would say a key part of the development that these people in the UK high potential pool are given, and that's replicated across other countries as well, is that they work in many organisations. They don't just, they may transfer to different departments, but they will go on secondments. They might go on secondments to charities, they might go on secondments to local government, the National Health Service, international organisations, whatever. So the idea is about giving them a very, very diverse experience, so that by the time they get into the senior ranks, they have that behind them. And also getting more diversity at senior levels is a very high priority in the UK civil service now. And this year they reached parity in terms of the number of men and women in permanent secretary positions. So I think that shows too, that used to be a very, very male-dominated civil service. I know that from my own time in the OECD, when I would be going around meeting with senior civil servants in various countries, and they have put a huge effort into that in the last few years, and it has really paid off in terms of getting those results. So I just want to talk now about that gives you a little bit more of that. What's there? I want to talk now about leadership capabilities, and as I said, they're being defined much more explicitly. Governments want to have people of, if you look at what they're saying, they want to have people of vision, courage, and integrity who can lead change. And these leadership capability profiles, again, they're not just something that are written down on the back of an envelope. They're typically developed through very careful research and validation, involving not only people within the public service, but also external stakeholders who quite often have their own view on what's needed. And capability profiles are a very central element of senior leadership strategies, and they are used to underpin a whole lot of other elements, such as selection into senior roles, identifying talent, as I said, developing future and current leaders, and so on. And the kinds of typical elements that you tend to see in them, and I think again these would resonate with some of the things that Eleanor talked about in her study, I've done some work looking across at common elements in these kinds of capability profiles, and these are the kinds of things you see. And it's a very diverse set of capabilities. And I think that as governments find that they just simply have to move away from rigid, centralised, highly bureaucratic systems, and the reason they're doing that is because those systems are not working well anymore, they are finding that a new type of leadership is needed. And they're finding that there's no room for the autocrat, the micromanager, the cult of personality, and it's very much now about reshaping the culture of the public service and recognising that this has to start from the top. At the same time, I would say that the other thing that these capability profiles show is that there's no single prescription for leadership. And as we saw again from Alma's model, top public servants are expected, they're expected to be deliverers, innovators, leaders of people, whatever it is. But when the command and control style of management is no longer an option, leadership through values and through example becomes your key tool in maintaining cohesion, in maintaining standards in the public service. And a key task that is expected of senior leaders is to infuse those values and the kinds of core public service values that Philip was talking about, that it's very important not to lose, and that is one of the key roles of the leader, is to infuse those values through the public service, so that it doesn't all have to be the centre holding the strings very tightly and controlling very tightly, but that by infusing that set of common values and common culture, you can have a different kind of cohesion that doesn't have to be run through centralised, highly bureaucratic controls. So I just wanted to show you a few examples of what these look like. That's the Australian Public Service. I hope that shows up okay. Yeah, that's the Australian Public Service Senior Leadership Profile. And as you can see again, it's got things like strategic thinking, results, working through people, personal drive, those kinds of things, and influencing, all those kinds of things that you might expect to find there. And that's used for a variety of purposes. And it's used to select people into senior roles, It's used for a very, very structured, systematic approach to leadership development, and that's not an optional thing. That is something that you need to go through as you are preparing yourself to compete for senior roles, and once you go into senior roles. It's used in performance management. Some of these elements are used to assess senior people, and it's used in planning that future pipeline of talent. And this is the Canadian one. That might look much, much simpler on paper, but sitting behind that is a very well-developed framework of capabilities for senior executives and examples of how they should be displayed in practice. And again, it's used for selection, it's used for development, and it's used in a very structured set of leadership development programs that have been running for a long time. And in fact, I think it's interesting to see now that Canada is actually providing those kinds of supports to other countries. I see at the moment that the Canadian Public Service Leadership Development Programme is being provided to Finland at the moment to help them, and I know Canada also does a lot of work in some other countries, some of the less developed countries in terms of doing that. So if you get it right, it could even become an export. We need everything we can get at the moment. Now, this list of expectations, this is what New Zealand's Deputy Prime Minister said late last year in terms of what was expected of New Zealand's civil servants. And again, New Zealand is a country that has put a lot of work into developing its leadership capability profile. And I think that this one is very interesting because it very much highlights that external thrust of why you're doing this. Again, you're not just doing it because it's a nice to have or because it looks nice on paper, but you're doing it because you want those people to deliver results for the people and for the country. And I think it's interesting to note that, of course, none of these things are happening in a vacuum. They're not just being done on their own. In all of the countries I've mentioned, and I'm sure many of you know this, this whole thing of developing the focus on leadership has happened as part of a very comprehensive set of public service reforms. So there have been all of those managerial reforms going on. There have been reforms of things like the industrial relations framework, etc., etc. And I think it's interesting to note, I mean, New Zealand has had a very long track record now of working with these kinds of things, and it's had time to find out what works and what doesn't. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether their agency model has worked well and whether it hasn't. And they've done a lot of re-engineering and fine-tuning of the system. But I think what's interesting to note is that when New Zealand had their own crisis, when they were shut out of the European markets back whenever it was, a couple of decades ago now, they really took public service reform as one of the things that they just took by the, what is the simile I want? It's not taking the bull by the horns, but anyway, they took it in their two hands. And they reformed it from top to bottom, and they did it very quickly. And I mean, one of the things they did was that they completely changed the employment framework and the industrial relations framework in both the public and the private sectors. And they in fact set up a common framework, a common industrial relations framework for that. So that's just one example, but they reformed departments, they reformed agencies, they did stuff on leadership, etc., etc. And they did it quite quickly, but they've constantly revisited it to get right the things that they thought weren't right. So I think that's important to say that these things do not sit in a vacuum. They have to be part and parcel of other things, and I think a number of the questioners quite rightly underlined that already. The New Zealand capability profile also has a very strong developmental focus. So a huge amount of effort is put into identifying leadership talent, and it's one of the stated accountabilities of chief executives of government departments and agencies is to do that and to begin to build that pipeline for the public service. And this is also used as the basis for development activities for chief executives and other senior managers, and they themselves are also expected to use it to plan their career and their development. And I think the other interesting thing is that this capability profile emphasises that there are diverse pathways to becoming a leader, and that those aspiring to reach senior levels are expected to develop their capabilities, and they're supported to do that. Again, through getting a range of very, very diverse experience. They're expected to move around, they're expected to have worked in lots of different places, and they haven't got a hope in applying for a senior position unless they can demonstrate that they've done that. They're not expected to do it on their own. There is a whole system around them to help them to do that, but it's very, very important for them. And just finally on that, this is the UK's framework. You see, Philip, if we need anything, we're going to have a nice picture, okay? So this is the UK's framework. Again, it's got many of the same sort of elements, of course. Setting direction, delivering results, developing people, and with values sitting very, very at the core. And again, we see things like self-awareness, innovating, challenging, acting, and so on. And I think it's not so much that those things are going to differ an awful lot. The kind of menu is there. But what's very important is that the people at the receiving end of this, both the senior public servants and the people at the receiving end, as the clients and customers of public services, do need to have a sense of ownership of this, and to do that they have to be involved in developing it. It's not something that can just be handed out to people. But as we can see, it makes it very, very explicit what is expected, and that is used to drive very, very strong accountability. Because it's not just there, it's not just about sending people off to training courses, but it's used in setting the accountabilities and the performance objectives for senior public servants, and it's used to have those discussions with them about how is it going, where are the gaps, etc., etc. And it's out there for everyone to see. It's not in a folder somewhere. I mean, you can look it up on the internet. So it's very, very visible. But again, I would underline that if these kinds of things are to have any lasting impact, that they have to be used to drive a whole range of actions. They have to be used to get this kind of integrated approach to things like selection of senior people, their development, identifying future leaders, and ultimately creating a more cohesive leadership culture right across the public service, where there's plenty of diversity, but people have those shared values and they have a common view of what leadership is about. Because that's what these are building. They're building that common shared view of what it is to be a leader. No doubt we have plenty of very, very good leaders in the public service at the moment. I have no doubt about that. But one of the things we're missing is that kind of common shared view that everybody knows exactly what it means, and that it's not just about everybody doing their own thing or in their own style. So I just want to finish off by talking a bit about developing leaders. And again, there is a very, very strong emphasis on this across OECD countries. And for many countries, that's not a new thing. And I can remember again when I was in the OECD working on public management issues, going to Sweden and visiting the Prime Minister's office. I think it was probably maybe around 1990, and I'm sure it was probably just around the time of the banking crisis and so on. And I can remember very senior people saying we're very, very concerned about leadership. We need to do something about leadership. What can you tell us? How can the OECD help us in terms of looking at models in our own countries, because we have to do something about this. So that kind of dialogue and discussion has been going on for quite a long time in some countries, whereas in others it's more recent. I mean, in Belgium, one of the things that drove it was all those awful scandals they had about those awful child murder scandals and so on and so forth, where it was shown that the police force was highly inept, and that there was that kind of sense of ineptitude on a number of other issues running right through the public service, and that led to a complete shake-up from top to bottom, including of how they recruit people, and again the definition of what they expect from people and so on in the public service. And I think they're having quite a bit of success with that. So as you see again with developing leaders, the pattern we're seeing across countries is that it's an integrated strategic approach. So again, it fits with the other things. It's not standalone. It's not just about saying let's send people off to some leadership courses and it'll all be fine. It's a service-wide approach to identify and develop diverse talent. Again, we see the diversity. It's multifaceted, and it's an ongoing process, even at the most senior levels. And I think that was underlined this morning by Brian Cawley as well, that it's not just about training, of course. And the typical kinds of elements that you see in this kind of thing are, first of all, involvement of central management bodies. So it's strategically driven by the centre. It's not handed off to a civil service college or whatever. Those things can play an important role, but they are not the owners and drivers of it. Senior executives, senior people in departments are very, very involved in it usually. They're very accountable for it. They're very accountable for identifying their own talented people through a transparent process and making sure that they get the structured, tailored development that they need. So it's very much one of the things that when you have a senior civil service group, that they themselves take on that responsibility. There are, generally you see a lot of different assignments, people given different kinds of work and so on and so forth, people given mentoring. And I think the key point is that it's not something that's left to chance, and it's not something informal. And it's very much about putting in resources into that to build up that kind of leadership calibre that countries think they want to have. And I'm just going to give you some brief examples here now. So, you know, in Finland, we see that they've set up this new program called the Public Management and Leadership Development Program. And as I said, they're working with Canada, in fact, on that. And that was set up by the Finnish Innovation Fund. And it's part of a very comprehensive set of reforms in Finland. And I should say that, you know, many of the countries that are doing these things, okay, they mightn't yet have the IMF bailing them out, but most of them are making very, very strong cutbacks in their public services and have very stringent, I mean the UK of course you've seen, they have very stringent cutbacks, but at the same time they see that they have to invest in these kinds of things. So they see that investment in leadership is something they need perhaps to give even more attention to when they have to cut back, so that cutbacks don't become, I think Philip alluded to that, the danger of completely destroying value in the public sector, so that you can have a sense of renewal going on. And I think that's something that's going to be a huge challenge for us in Ireland. So it's not my role to talk about Ireland, but I think it is just looking at what's been happening in other countries. I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. And the other thing I just wanted to illustrate here is there are many different ways of approaching this. I mean, Canada used to have a very centrally run system. Now they've decided to move that back to departmentally run programs. But they're doing that within a very long tradition of how to do it. And a very, I would say they have built up that cohesive service-wide leadership cadre, which is capable of doing that. On the other hand, New Zealand started off by saying, oh, we don't need to do that. That's something we can leave to departments and agencies. And then a couple of years ago, about 6 or 7 years ago, they said, well, actually, we're worried about leadership and we don't think we're doing enough to do it, and we think we needed something we need to take a much more centralised strategic approach to. So they shifted that and they set up their Leadership Development Centre and developed this capability profile that you saw, and so on. So that's just... I just want to finish off by briefly touching on two important things. One of them I've mentioned already, diversity, and the other is innovation. I mean, they're both much talked about in the context of leadership in both the public and private sectors. And of course, they're much more difficult to achieve in practice. And they're closely linked because there is a growing body of research on the importance of diversity in organisations. And again, that's people with a whole variety of backgrounds, mindsets, etc. And that's very important for increasing the capacity for innovation. And I think Alma will distribute my slides, but if you distribute them in notes form, you'll see I've provided a whole list of references to that kind of research that's being done on innovation, particularly in the public service. So diversity is a key part of senior leadership strategies in countries. And as I said, where it is and where real effort is being put into it, it's paying off. But I find it hard to think of a public service in an OECD country that says that has not said that it needs more innovation. And of course, the culture of the public service, as Philip said, does tend to be, and I think it came out very strongly in the survey as well, in the study, it tends to be inimical to innovation. And the research shows that hierarchy, bureaucracy, and risk aversion stifle innovation. And of course, even where politicians say that they want it from the public service, when they get it, they find they don't always want it after all. So it is a real tough one. And creating the conditions that allow innovations to flourish in the public sector is difficult. And as I said, there is some research that highlights the kind of leadership that fosters innovation. And you'll find that it mentions things like open-mindedness, people being self-aware, leaving space for others to contribute, especially people in the middle ranks and at the front line, not stifling that. That's very, very important. And it really does require quite a different sort of leadership. And I think that those leadership profiles that I showed you, those examples from various countries, I think that they are taking some steps now in trying to create that leadership profile in the public service. But I don't think, I think personally that there's lots of innovation going on in this country in the public service. I was involved with NESDO, the National Economic and Social Development Office, last year or the year before in an initiative called Futures Ireland, where they brought in a very, very broad range of people from the public sector, private sector, community, the arts world, etc., etc. And one of the things they did was they asked them to tell stories about innovation and things they had done and how they had done them, and from that they were able to they tried to draw out some interesting patterns about how that had happened. And that's published. It's a very interesting study. And what that showed was that there actually were loads of innovative things going on, but the problem was that they were going on in little pockets. And a lot of them were going on maybe in agencies, and some of them were going on in bodies that were being funded but weren't directly public service. And there was a real problem both in sharing that across. For example, we saw some great things going on in some county councils in some areas, but there was no sharing across to others. And so there seems to be problems both in disseminating it and in scaling it up. But I think that there are plenty of green shoots of innovation there, and again, that's going to be one of the challenges in developing the kind of leadership culture that is going to allow those green shoots maybe to blossom into something else. And then just finally, I want to say that, of course, none of this is easy. And some of the issues that have come up elsewhere that can derail these kinds of public service leadership issues, quite apart from the fact that it has to be resourced, is the tall poppy syndrome. That's been a real issue, for example, in some of the Nordic countries where there's a really egalitarian culture, and I think, Philip, you referred to it as well, that it can be seen as elitist, or it can be seen as favouring people. But that is, that's why it's very important to make these things very explicit, to make them very transparent, very systematic, and then it really does become about merit. It's entirely consistent with strong merit-based systems, because everybody can see where the bar is and how you get over it, and what's there to help you to do that and to support you. But nevertheless, that is, I think, a cultural issue that has to be overcome, certainly in some countries. It's one of, for example, that the Finns have specifically talked about in terms of something they've had to contend with. And then, another thing is that you have to have, this is always said about change initiatives, but you do have to have that top-level commitment and leadership if it's going to be there. The other thing that can derail is that if it's done in a piecemeal fashion, there does need to be that strong strategic focus so that the pieces join up. And it has to become systemic, it has to be institutionalised, and it has to become integrated with other systemic things that are being done, so that you do get that push forward of things happening together. And I think there has to be a willingness to learn from others. We have to look outside, other countries have looked outside, there's plenty of experience out there, and we can learn from others. And I think finally that there certainly is that danger of losing capacity during periods of downsizing. It's very, very acute. Of course, personally, I did a study on this for the OECD last year, looking at the experience over the past couple of decades of downsizing the public sector. And it's this problem of loss of capacity is very, very acute. Personally, I'm not a public employee, so I can say what I like, but I'm not in favour of this death by 1,000 cuts and attrition, because it prolongs the pain, it makes it very hard to manage, and I would say that, if you can possibly manage to do it in some other way, don't do it by attrition and by not filling posts as people retire and so on and so forth. I know there are a whole set of reasons why certain countries, including our own, do it like that, but the results tend to be very poor in terms of that loss of morale and loss of capacity and for the public service. And I do think that, as you said, there's a very, very big challenge in terms of building up that leadership capability at the same time as that's happening. Thank you.